"The defense counsel has withdrawn," Captain Randall Whitmore announced, his voice carrying across the military courtroom with barely concealed satisfaction. Given the severity of the charges and the accused failure to secure adequate representation, the prosecution moves to proceed immediately. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Rear Admiral Margaret Chen sat alone at the defendant's table, the empty chair beside her a testament to betrayal. Her Navy-appointed lawyer had withdrawn that morning, citing conflicts of interest that everyone in the courtroom understood were nothing more than political cowardice. 32 years of exemplary service, and she had been abandoned to face the wolves alone. Captain Whitmore straightened his dress whites, turning slightly toward the VIP observation section where Vice Admiral Gordon Thatch sat with his hands folded across his chest. The two men exchanged the briefest of glances, a silent confirmation that everything was proceeding according to plan. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the dark wood paneling that absorbed what little warmth the room might have offered. In the back row of the gallery, a man in clothes that had clearly come from a donation gripped the wooden bench in front of him. His knuckles whitened against the grain. Elias Crenshaw had slipped in during the lunch recess, drawn by something he could not name, and now he watched injustice unfold with the practiced eye of someone who had seen it before. His gray beard was unkempt, his jacket held together at one seam with duct tape, and the courthouse security had nearly turned him away at the door. But he had learned years ago how to move through spaces where he did not belong, how to become invisible when visibility meant removal. The senior judge, a captain with silver eagles gleaming at his collar, leaned forward. "Admiral Chen, you understand the gravity of proceeding without counsel." "I do, Your Honor." Admiral Chen's voice remained steady, though Elias could see from across the room the slight tremor in her hands as they rested on the table before her. "I will represent myself." A murmur rippled through the gallery. Retired officers in civilian suits exchanged uncomfortable glances. Active duty personnel in their dress uniforms shifted in their seats. This was not how military justice was supposed to work. Even the guilty deserved representation. Captain Whitmore smiled. "The prosecution is prepared to demonstrate that Rear Admiral Chen systematically engaged in dereliction of duty, misappropriation of medical resources, and conduct unbecoming an officer. We will present evidence of a pattern of negligence that endangered the lives of service members under her care." Elias felt his jaw tighten. He knew manufactured evidence when he saw it. 20 years in courtrooms had taught him to read the rhythm of a rigged proceeding, to hear the rehearsed quality in accusations designed to destroy rather than illuminate. This was not a prosecution. This was an execution. Vice Admiral Thatch uncrossed his arms and leaned back in his seat, satisfaction settling across his features like a mask he had worn so long it had become his face. From where Elias sat, he could see the Admiral's eyes fixed on Chun with something that went beyond professional interest. There was hunger there. There was ownership. Before we continue, wherever you're watching from around the world, we would love to know. Drop a comment telling us your city or country. Stories like this one about courage, sacrifice, and standing up when everyone else sits down happen everywhere. You might have a quiet hero in your own community whose humble appearance hides an extraordinary heart. And if these stories speak to you, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support helps us share more incredible true accounts that honor those who refuse to let injustice stand unchallenged. Now let us continue. The panel will hear opening statements, the senior judge announced. "Captain Whitmore, you may proceed." Whitmore rose with the theatrical precision of a man who had practiced this moment in the mirror. He buttoned his jacket, adjusted his posture, and began to speak in the cadenced tones of someone reading a eulogy for a person not yet dead. Elias watched Admiral Chen's face as the accusations mounted. Dereliction, negligence, resources diverted, lives endangered. Each charge landed like a blow, and though she kept her composure, he could see her shoulders drawing inward, her spine curving almost imperceptibly under the weight of lies dressed as truth. His hand moved unconsciously to his chest, where beneath the worn fabric of his shirt, Elena's nursing pin pressed against his skin. He carried it always, the small gold symbol of her profession, of her dedication to healing, of everything he had failed to protect. The courtroom blurred for a moment as memory threatened to overwhelm the present. Elena had believed in the law. She had believed that justice would keep her safe, that the system would hold. And when that system had failed her, when the man who took her life had walked free on appeal, Elias had broken in ways that 6 years on the streets had not yet mended. But Admiral Chun was not Elena. Admiral Chun was still alive. And in exactly 47 minutes, everything Captain Whitmore thought he knew about this proceeding would shatter against a truth he never saw coming. Because the homeless man in the back row, the one the bailiff had almost refused to admit, was not just watching. He was remembering. And remembering, for a man like Elias Crenshaw, was the first step toward standing up. The courtroom faded at its edges as Elias watched Captain Whitmore gesture toward the prosecution's evidence table. The movement was familiar, theatrical, designed to draw attention. Elias had made that same gesture 1,000 times in courtrooms across the world. Though his hands had been steadier then, his uniform pressed and perfect, his purpose clear. 23 years old and fresh from law school, he had stood before his first military tribunal with the absolute certainty that justice was a machine that worked when you fed it truth. The Navy had given him everything. Structure when his childhood had offered chaos. Purpose when his father's abandonment had left a void. And the law, the beautiful architecture of the law, had given him a way to protect those who could not protect themselves. But the law had not been enough. He remembered the day he had walked into the BUD/S selection office at Coronado, already a lieutenant in the JAG Corps, already building a reputation as a defender of the wrongly accused. The instructor had looked at his service record and laughed. "Lawyers don't make it through Hell Week," he had said. "Go back to your briefs and your courtrooms." Elias had not gone back. 6 months later, he had earned his trident, one of only 3 officers in Navy history to complete both law school and basic underwater demolition training. They had called him crazy. They had called him obsessed. Elena had called him something else entirely. "You want to protect them with your words and your hands," she had said the night he pinned the golden trident to his chest beside his JAG insignia. "You want to be their shield and their voice." He had looked at her then, this woman who had seen through every wall he had ever built, and he had known she was right. The law could free a man from prison. But sometimes the law needed someone willing to carry a rifle into the darkness to bring that man home first. Operation Blind Justice. The name surfaced in his memory like a body rising from deep water. Nazariah, 2003. 19 hours holding a position in a shattered building while insurgents probed their defenses, and 3 Marines sat in a military prison awaiting court-martial for crimes they did not commit. Elias had done both. Rifle in one hand, satellite phone pressed to his ear with the other, arguing motions and filing briefs while bullets chipped the concrete around him. 11 men had survived that night because he refused to retreat. 3 Marines had walked free because the evidence he had gathered and the arguments he had constructed had proven their innocence beyond any doubt. The men he served with had started calling him Sentinel after that. The one who watches, the one who guards. But he had not been able to guard Elena. The memory hit him like shrapnel, sudden and sharp. Her face in the morning light. Her laugh when he complained about paperwork. The way she would trace the scar on his throat, the one he had earned in an extraction gone wrong, and whisper that she was grateful the knife had missed anything vital. She had been a Navy nurse, dedicated to healing the wounds that men like him carried home from war. She had believed in second chances, in redemption, in the possibility that even the most broken could be made whole. And then Marcus Devlin had been released on appeal. Elias had prosecuted him 4 years earlier. Assault with intent to kill. The evidence had been overwhelming, the conviction certain. But a technicality, a single procedural error in the chain of custody, had given Devlin's lawyers the opening they needed. The conviction was overturned. Devlin walked free. 3 weeks later, Elena was dead. The police had called it a home invasion. They had called it random violence. But Elias had known. He had seen the way Devlin had looked at him during the trial, the promise in those eyes. Devlin had taken Elena because the law had taken his freedom, and when the law gave that freedom back, Devlin had taken something in return. Elias had stopped eating, stopped sleeping, stopped believing that the system he had devoted his life to serving could ever deliver the justice it promised. He had written a single sentence on a legal pad, left it on his desk at the JAG Corps office, and walked away from everything. The law failed her. I failed her. I cannot serve what I cannot believe in. 6 years under the Harbor Street Bridge. 6 years watching the courthouse from the loading dock where he earned enough for food by moving boxes and cleaning floors. 6 years carrying Elena's nursing pin against his chest and her photograph in his pocket, speaking to her in the darkness, apologizing for surviving when she had not. But now, in this courtroom, watching Admiral Margaret Chin sit alone while manufactured evidence piled up around her, Elias felt something stir that he had thought long dead. Whitmore was presenting falsified reports with the confidence of a man who knew the outcome had already been decided. Vice Admiral Thatch was watching from the gallery with the satisfaction of a predator who had cornered his prey. And Admiral Chun, who had done nothing wrong except refuse a powerful man's advances, was going to lose everything. Elias knew the shape of this injustice. He had seen it before, in different courtrooms, wearing different uniforms. The law was supposed to be blind, but too often it only closed its eyes to those who could afford to purchase its silence. His hand found Elena's pin through the fabric of his shirt. He pressed it against his palm until the edges bit into his skin. "You told me to fight for them," he whispered, words meant only for her. All of them. Captain Whitmore finished his opening statement with a flourish, turning to face the gallery as if expecting applause. The senior judge called for the defense's response, and Admiral Chun rose on unsteady legs to face the tribunal alone. Elias watched her struggle to find words, to organize a defense against accusations designed to be indefensible, and he felt the weight of his silence pressing down on his chest like a boot on his throat. He had been silent for 6 years. He was not certain he could be silent for 6 more minutes. Captain Whitmore approached the evidence table with the deliberate pace of a man savoring his own performance. He lifted a folder thick with documents, holding it aloft for the panel to see before turning to address the courtroom with the gravity of a preacher delivering a sermon on sin. The evidence before this tribunal, he began, represents a systematic pattern of failure at the highest levels of Naval Medical Command. Rear Admiral Chun, entrusted with the health and welfare of thousands of service members, chose instead to pursue her own agenda at the expense of those she was sworn to protect. Elias leaned forward slightly, his eyes tracking every movement, every inflection. He had spent 2 decades reading courtrooms the way other men read newspapers, and what he saw now made his stomach turn. This was not prosecution. This was theater, carefully choreographed, with a verdict written before the first witness was called. Admiral Chun sat motionless at the defense table, her hands folded before her with the rigid discipline of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. The empty chair beside her seemed to grow larger with each passing moment, a void that swallowed whatever hope she might have carried into this room. Whitmore lifted the first document from his folder. Exhibit A. A requisition order for medical supplies dated March 15th of last year. Admiral Chun authorized the transfer of over $200,000 in equipment from Naval Medical Center San Diego to a civilian facility in Tijuana. He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Equipment paid for by American taxpayers, intended for American service members, diverted to a foreign nation without proper authorization. The gallery stirred. Elias caught the slight shake of Admiral Chen's head, the silent denial that no one was positioned to voice on her behalf. He knew what Whitmore was doing. Strip the context, present the facts in isolation, and even the most innocent action could be made to look like betrayal. What Whitmore was not saying, what the prosecution had no intention of revealing, was that the civilian facility in Tijuana had been treating wounded Marines who could not be moved across the border without endangering their lives. Elias did not know this for certain. but he knew the shape of manufactured outrage. He had built cases against it for 15 years. Vice Admiral Thatch shifted in the VIP section, uncrossing his legs and leaning forward with an expression of practiced concern. His uniform was immaculate, his silver hair precisely trimmed, every detail of his appearance designed to project authority and trustworthiness. But Elias had learned long ago to watch men's eyes rather than their posture, and Thatch's eyes were fixed on Admiral Chun with something that went far beyond professional interest. There was possession in that gaze. There was hunger. Whitmore continued, lifting document after document, each one another brick in the wall he was building around Admiral Chen's career. Testimony from officers who had been transferred immediately after filing their reports. Budget analyses that stripped away context until the numbers told whatever story the prosecution wanted them to tell. Performance reviews that had been glowing until 6 months ago, when they suddenly turned critical. 6 months ago, Elias filed the timeline away in his mind. Something had changed 6 months ago, some event that had transformed Admiral Chun from an exemplary officer into a target. Master Chief Petty Officer Dwayne Hollister stood at attention near the main entrance, his position giving him a clear view of the entire courtroom. Elias had noticed him earlier, the way the older man's eyes moved constantly, cataloging every face, every movement. 30-plus years of service had carved deep lines into Hollister's face, and something in his expression suggested he was as uncomfortable with this proceeding as Elias was. Their eyes met briefly across the gallery. Hollister's gaze lingered on Elias for a moment longer than necessary. A flicker of something that might have been recognition or might have been simple curiosity about the homeless man who had somehow found his way into a military tribunal. Admiral Chun, Whitmore said, his voice rising with theatrical indignation, when confronted with these irregularities, chose not to cooperate with the investigation. She chose instead to file a complaint against Vice Admiral Thatch, a complaint that this tribunal will demonstrate was nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect attention from her own misconduct. Elias felt his hands curl in his fists. There it was, the connection he had sensed but could not prove. Admiral Chun had reported Thatch for something, and this tribunal was the response. Not justice, retaliation, objection. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the courtroom, stronger than Elias had expected. The timing of my complaint and this investigation is directly relevant to the accusations against me. I request that my report be entered into evidence. Whitmore turned smoothly, his smile never wavering. Your Honor, the defendant's complaint against Vice Admiral Thatch has been reviewed and found to be without merit. It is irrelevant to the charges at hand and would only serve to distract from the evidence of her misconduct. The senior judge barely paused before responding. Objection sustained. The complaint will not be admitted. Admiral Chen's shoulders dropped almost imperceptibly. Elias watched her reach for a glass of water, watched her hand tremble as she lifted it to her lips. She was fighting alone against a system that had already decided her fate, and every avenue of defense was being systematically closed before she could reach it. In the VIP section, Vice Admiral Thatch allowed himself a small smile. It was the smile of a man watching a trap close around prey that had dared to challenge him. Lieutenant Commander Rosa Vega sat in the press section, her pen moving furiously across a legal pad. Unlike the military journalists around her, she was not recording Whitmore's accusations. She was documenting the objections, the sustained rulings, the pattern of exclusion that was preventing Admiral Chun from mounting any meaningful defense. Elias recognized the look on her face. He had worn it himself years ago when he had first begun to understand that justice was not guaranteed simply because it was deserved. Whitmore called his first witness, a lieutenant commander who had served under Admiral Chun until his sudden transfer 4 months prior. The man took the stand with the wooden posture of someone who had been coached on exactly what to say and how to say it. As the questioning began, Elias felt something shift in his chest. It was not quite anger, though anger was part of it. It was not quite grief, though Elena's face flickered at the edge of his vision. It was something older and deeper, something he had buried beneath 6 years of silence and self-destruction. It was purpose, and it was demanding that he remember who he used to be. The witness settled into the stand with the rehearsed discomfort of a man who knew his lines but had not yet learned to deliver them naturally. Lieutenant Commander Paul Brennan had served as Admiral Chen's executive assistant for 3 years before his abrupt transfer to a supply depot in Guam. His uniform was crisp, his posture rigid, and his eyes never once met those of the woman he was about to condemn. Lieutenant Commander Brennan, Whitmore began, approaching the witness stand with measured steps. You served directly under Admiral Chen's command at Naval Medical Center San Diego. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And during your tenure, did you observe any irregularities in Admiral Chen's management of medical resources? Brennan swallowed visibly before answering. Yes, sir. On multiple occasions, I witnessed Admiral Chen authorize transfers of equipment and personnel without following proper requisition procedures. Elias watched the testimony unfold with the clinical detachment of a surgeon observing an operation performed by incompetent hands. Every answer was too quick, too precise, delivered with the cadence of memorization rather than recollection. Brennan was not lying exactly. He was reciting a version of truth that had been carefully edited to support a predetermined conclusion. Admiral Chen rose to cross-examine, and Elias felt a surge of something like hope. She was a flag officer, a woman who had commanded thousands, who had navigated the treacherous waters of military politics for 3 decades. Surely she would find the weakness in this testimony, the thread that would unravel the prosecution's case. Lieutenant Commander Brennan, she began, her voice steady but strained. When you say I authorized transfers without proper procedures, are you referring to the emergency medical supplies sent to the Tijuana facility in March of last year? Brennan hesitated. Among other instances, yes, ma'am. And are you aware that those supplies were sent to treat 4 Marines who had been wounded in a training accident across the border and could not be safely transported back to San Diego? Objection. Whitmore's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. The defendant is testifying rather than questioning the witness. Sustained. The senior judge did not even look up from his notes. Admiral Chen pressed on, her composure beginning to crack at the edges. Lieutenant Commander, were you present when Vice Admiral Thatch visited my office on September 14th of last year? Brennan's face went pale. I do not recall the specific date, ma'am. Let me refresh your memory. It was the day before you submitted your transfer request. The day Vice Admiral Thatch and I had a private meeting in my office that ended with raised voices. Objection. Whitmore was on his feet, his earlier composure replaced by something sharper. Relevance. The defendant is attempting to introduce excluded material through the back door. Sustained. The judge's voice carried a warning now. Admiral Chen, you will confine your questions to matters relevant to the charges at hand. Elias watched Admiral Chen's shoulders sag almost imperceptibly. She was fighting with both hands tied behind her back, every avenue of defense blocked before she could pursue it. The harassment complaint she had filed against Thatch was the key to everything, the motive that explained why a decorated officer was suddenly facing career-ending charges, but the tribunal had ruled it inadmissible. She tried a different approach. Lieutenant Commander, in your 3 years serving under my command, how many commendations did the Naval Medical Center receive? Brennan shifted uncomfortably. Several, ma'am. 17. We received 17 commendations for excellence in patient care, emergency response, and resource management. Were any of those commendations rescinded or called into question before these charges were filed? No, ma'am. And in your professional opinion, based on your 3 years of direct observation, would you characterize my leadership as negligent or derelict? Brennan opened his mouth, closed it, and glanced toward the prosecution table where Whitmore sat with his arms crossed. The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats, then 4, then 5. I am not qualified to make that assessment, ma'am. It was not an answer. It was an evasion, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. But it was also the closest thing to honesty Brennan had offered since taking the stand. Admiral Chen returned to the defense table, her steps slower than when she had risen. She gathered her notes with hands that trembled visibly now, and when she looked up, her eyes swept across the gallery, as if searching for something she knew she would not find. Her gaze passed over Elias without recognition. Why would she notice him? He was just another face in the crowd, another spectator to her destruction, indistinguishable from the retired officers and curious civilians who had come to watch a flag officer fall. But Elias noticed her. He noticed the way she straightened her spine, even as hope drained from her eyes. He noticed the dignity she maintained even as the system she had served for 32 years turned its machinery against her. He noticed the wedding ring she still wore, though the courthouse records he had glimpsed while working the loading dock indicated she had been widowed 7 years ago. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. Elena's voice echoed in his memory, soft and certain. Then fight for them, Eli. All of them. He had failed Elena. He had failed himself. He had spent 6 years believing that his failure meant he no longer had the right to stand, to speak, to defend those who could not defend themselves. But Admiral Chun was not asking for a perfect champion. She was not asking for a hero without scars or a defender without doubt. She was asking, without words, without even knowing he existed, for someone to stand beside her when everyone else had walked away. Whitmore rose to call his next witness, his confidence restored, his victory all but assured. And Elias Crenshaw, homeless veteran, broken man, former sentinel, felt the weight of his silence become heavier than the weight of standing up. The decision was not made in a single moment. It was made in 1,000 moments, stretching back through 6 years of darkness to a night in Nazariah when he had learned that some battles required both a rifle and a legal brief. His feet were not moving yet, but they would. The second witness took the stand with the polished confidence of an officer who had already been promised something in exchange for his testimony. Commander Victor Salinas had transferred out of Admiral Chen's command 8 months prior, and unlike Brennan, he showed no hesitation when Whitmore approached him with questions designed to bury a career. Commander Salinas, Whitmore began, "You supervised logistics and supply chain operations at Naval Medical Center San Diego. During your time in that role, did you have occasion to observe Admiral Chen's management decisions?" "I did, sir. Frequently." "And what was your assessment of those decisions?" Salinas leaned forward slightly, as if eager to deliver lines he had memorized. Admiral Chen consistently prioritized her personal relationships over proper protocol. She diverted resources based on favoritism rather than need. She created a culture of fear where officers were afraid to report irregularities because they knew she would retaliate. Elias felt his fingernails digging into his palms. The accusations were specific enough to sound credible, but vague enough to be impossible to disprove. This was character assassination dressed in the language of professional concern, and the panel was absorbing every word. "Can you provide a specific example?" Whitmore prompted. Salinas nodded. "In February of last year, Admiral Chun ordered me to falsify inventory reports to cover a shortage in surgical supplies. When I refused, she threatened to end my career. I submitted my transfer request the following week." The gallery erupted in murmurs. The senior judge called for order, but the damage was done. Falsification of records was a serious charge, and Salinas had delivered it with the conviction of a man telling the absolute truth. Admiral Chun was on her feet before the judge finished speaking. "That is a lie. I never asked Commander Salinas to falsify anything. The shortage he is referring to was caused by a vendor error that was corrected within 48 hours. "Admiral Chun," the senior judge's voice carried a sharp warning. "You will have your opportunity to cross-examine. You will not interrupt testimony." She remained standing for a moment longer, her chest rising and falling with barely controlled fury, before slowly lowering herself back into her chair. Her isolation was complete now. No counsel to object on her behalf. No advocate to challenge the lies being spoken as fact. Just a woman alone against a system that had already chosen its verdict. Whitmore continued his direct examination, drawing out more accusations, more carefully crafted implications. Salinas spoke of meetings that had never happened, decisions that had never been made, a pattern of misconduct that existed only in the narrative the prosecution had constructed. And through it all, Vice Admiral Thatch watched from the VIP section with the patient satisfaction of a man who had learned long ago that power was not about strength. It was about controlling the story. Elias studied Thatch's face, reading the subtle tells that most observers would miss. The slight upturn at the corner of his mouth when Salinas delivered a particularly damaging line. The way his fingers drummed silently against his thigh in a rhythm that matched Whitmore's pacing. The brief glances he exchanged with the senior judge during crucial moments of testimony. This was not a tribunal. This was a coordinated execution, and everyone involved knew their role except the woman being destroyed. Admiral Chun rose to cross-examine, and Elias could see the exhaustion settling into her shoulders. She had been fighting alone for hours now, absorbing blow after blow, and the strain was beginning to show. "Commander Salinas," she began, her voice thinner than before, "you testified that I threatened to end your career when you refused to falsify reports. Is that correct?" "Yes, ma'am. And yet your fitness reports from that period, which I have here, indicate that I gave you the highest possible ratings in every category." She held up a document, her hand trembling slightly. "Does that seem consistent with retaliation?" Salinas did not miss a beat. "With respect, ma'am, you were covering your tracks. You knew that negative reports would raise questions about your own conduct. It was a perfect answer, impossible to counter, designed to turn even exculpatory evidence into proof of guilt." Admiral Chun stared at the document in her hand, as if seeing it for the first time, and Elias watched the last flicker of hope die in her eyes. She asked a few more questions, each one deflected with the same rehearsed precision, before finally returning to the defense table. Her shoulders were curved inward now, her posture that of someone who had accepted defeat even as they continued to go through the motions of resistance. "The prosecution rests," Whitmore announced, straightening his uniform jacket with a satisfied tug. "We are prepared for closing arguments at the panel's convenience." The senior judge nodded. "We will take a 15-minute recess before closing statements." He struck his gavel once, and the courtroom began to stir. Elias did not move. Around him, officers rose to stretch their legs, to murmur amongst themselves about the foregone conclusion they had just witnessed. Master Chief Hollister remained at his post by the door, his eyes scanning the room with the practiced vigilance of a career sailor. Admiral Chun sat alone at the defense table, her head bowed over documents she was no longer reading. Her fingers traced the edge of a photograph that Elias could not see from his position, and he wondered if she too carried ghosts with her into courtrooms where justice had already been decided. 15 minutes. In 15 minutes, Whitmore would deliver a closing argument that would seal Admiral Chen's fate. In 15 minutes, the panel would deliberate for a token period before returning the verdict that had been written before the first witness was called. In 15 minutes, a 32-year career would end in disgrace, and a man who had abused his power would walk away untouched. Elias felt Elena's nursing pin pressing against his chest. He felt the weight of 6 years of silence crushing the air from his lungs. He felt the memories of every man and woman he had defended, every injustice he had fought, every time he had stood when standing seemed impossible. His feet were moving before his mind gave permission. He was walking toward the defense table. He was going to speak. Admiral Chin looked up as the shadow fell across her table, and for a moment her expression held nothing but confusion. The man standing before her wore clothes that hung loose on a frame that had once been powerful, his gray beard unkempt, his eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who had stopped expecting kindness from the world. "Mum." His voice was hoarse, rough from disuse, but something in its timbre made her straighten in her seat. "I would like to represent you." She stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign language. "I am sorry, I do not understand. You need counsel. I am offering my services." Around them, the courtroom continued its recess murmur. Officers clustered in small groups, discussing the inevitable verdict. No one paid attention to the homeless man standing at the defense table. No one except Master Chief Hollister, whose hand moved slowly toward the radio at his belt. "Sir." Admiral Chin's voice was gentle, the tone one might use with someone who had wandered into the wrong room. "I appreciate the thought, but this is a military tribunal. Only licensed attorneys with proper standing can appear before this panel." Elias reached into the inner pocket of his worn jacket and produced a card so creased and faded that the text was barely legible. "Commander Elias Crenshaw, United States Navy, retired. JAG Corps, bar number 77439. My license is still active. I checked last month." Admiral Chun took the card with fingers that had begun to tremble again, though for a different reason now. She studied the faded print, then looked up at the man before her with eyes that were searching for deception and finding none. "Crenshaw." She said the name slowly, as if testing its weight. "I know that name." Before Elias could respond, a sharp voice cut across the courtroom. "What is going on here?" Captain Whitmore strode toward the defense table, his face flushed with irritation at this disruption to his carefully orchestrated proceeding. Behind him, Vice Admiral Thatch had risen from his seat in the VIP section, his expression shifting from satisfaction to uncertainty. "This man claims to be an attorney," Admiral Chun said, her voice carrying a note of something that might have been hope. "He is offering to represent me." Whitmore looked at Elias with undisguised contempt, taking in the donated clothes, the unkempt appearance, the obvious signs of prolonged hardship. "This is absurd. Security, remove this individual from the courtroom immediately." Master Chief Hollister stepped forward, but his movement was slow, his eyes fixed on Elias with an intensity that suggested something other than simple duty. "Sir," he said, addressing Whitmore while still watching Elias, "if this man has valid credentials, he may have standing to appear. He is clearly disturbed." Whitmore's voice rose with theatrical outrage. "Look at him. This is a military tribunal, not a homeless shelter." Elias turned to face Whitmore directly, and something in his bearing shifted. The stoop in his shoulders straightened. His chin lifted. His eyes, which had been downcast and weary, now met Whitmore's with a steadiness that made the prosecutor take an involuntary step backward. "Captain," Elias said, and his voice was different now, clearer, carrying the precise diction of a man who had spent decades in courtrooms, "I suggest you review Article 38 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice before you embarrass yourself further." Whitmore blinked. "What did you say to me?" "Article 38, Section B. The accused has the right to be represented by civilian counsel if provided at no expense to the United States, or by military counsel of the accused's own selection if reasonably available." Elias paused, letting the words settle. "Admiral Chun has selected me. I am reasonably available. My credentials are valid. Unless you intend to argue that a flag officer of the United States Navy does not deserve the representation guaranteed by the Code we all swore to uphold." The courtroom had gone silent. Officers who had been chatting in small groups now stood frozen, watching the confrontation at the defense table. Lieutenant Commander Vega had stopped writing, her pen suspended above her notepad. "This is highly irregular," Whitmore managed, but his voice had lost its commanding edge. "So is prosecuting a decorated admiral on manufactured evidence," Elias replied. His gaze swept across the courtroom, pausing briefly on Vice Admiral Thatch before returning to Whitmore. "But we will address that in due course." Admiral Chun rose from her seat, and when she spoke, her voice carried the authority of 32 years of command. "Captain Whitmore, I am exercising my right under Article 38. I accept Commander Crenshaw as my counsel." The senior judge had returned to the bench during the confrontation, drawn by the raised voices. He looked from Whitmore to Elias to Admiral Chun, his expression caught between irritation and uncertainty. "What is the nature of this disruption?" he demanded. Whitmore turned to the bench, his composure partially restored. "Your Honor, this individual claims to be a licensed attorney and wishes to represent the defendant. I submit that his appearance and demeanor suggest he is not competent to participate in these proceedings." The judge studied Elias with narrowed eyes. "Do you have identification, Commander?" Elias reached into his pocket again and produced a military ID card, worn and faded but still valid. He held it up for the judge to see. The judge examined it for a long moment, then turned to the court clerk. "Verify these credentials immediately." The clerk hurried to comply, and for several minutes the courtroom hung in suspended silence. Elias stood motionless at the defense table, his bearing now unmistakably military despite his civilian clothes. Admiral Chun had moved to stand beside him, her presence a declaration of trust in a man she had met only moments ago. The clerk returned with a printout, her face pale. "Your Honor," she said, "the credentials are valid. Commander Elias Crenshaw, Judge Advocate General Corps, admitted to the bar in 1991. License is current." The judge's jaw tightened, but he had no grounds for refusal. "Very well. Commander Crenshaw, you may represent the defendant. We will resume in 10 minutes. Whitmore opened his mouth to object, but the judge silenced him with a look. "This tribunal will follow proper procedure, Captain. All of it." As the judge withdrew to his chambers, Elias turned to Admiral Chun. "The hardest part," he said quietly, "is just beginning. But you are not alone anymore." For the first time since the tribunal began, Admiral Chun allowed herself to believe that might be true. The 10-minute recess stretched into 20 as Admiral Chun spread what little documentation she had across the defense table. Elias absorbed it all with the focused intensity of a man relearning a language he had once spoken fluently. His eyes moved across requisition forms, testimony transcripts, and evidence lists, his mind cataloging inconsistencies that the prosecution had hoped no one would notice. "This evidence list," he said, tapping a page with a finger that bore calluses from years of manual labor. "When was it provided to you?" Admiral Chun leaned closer, her voice low. 3 days before the tribunal began. I filed a motion for continuance to review the materials, but it was denied." 3 days. Elias shook his head slowly. "For a case this complex, you should have had 30 at minimum. They wanted you unprepared. They wanted me destroyed." Her voice carried no self-pity, only the grim acknowledgement of a warrior who understood the battlefield she occupied. "Commander Crenshaw, I need you to understand something. Vice Admiral Thatch is connected at the highest levels. He has allies on this panel. Whatever you attempt in there, the outcome may already be decided." Elias looked up from the documents, and something in his eyes made Admiral Chun fall silent. "I have stood in courtrooms where the outcome was decided before I arrived," he said. "I have defended men who everyone assumed were guilty. I have argued cases where the judges, the prosecutors, and the witnesses were all working toward the same predetermined verdict." He paused, his gaze drifting briefly toward the empty gallery before returning to her. "The outcome is decided right up until the moment it is not." She studied his face, searching for the source of his certainty. "You speak like someone who has done this before." "I have. The JAG Corps trains excellent lawyers, but you are different. There is something else." She gestured at his weathered hands, the scar visible at his collar, the bearing that seemed to shift between defeated vagrant and coiled warrior. "Who are you, Commander?" Before Elias could answer, the bailiff announced that the tribunal would reconvene in 5 minutes. He gathered the documents and squared them into a neat stack, his movements precise and economical. "I am someone who made a promise," he said finally, "a long time ago, to someone who believed that the law could protect people if someone was willing to fight for it." He met her eyes. "I stopped believing that for a while. Maybe I still do not believe it entirely. But I believe you deserve better than what is happening in this courtroom. That will have to be enough." Admiral Chun placed her hand briefly on his arm. "It is enough, Commander. It is more than I had an hour ago." They took their positions at the defense table as the gallery refilled with observers. Elias noticed that the composition had shifted during the extended recess. More officers had arrived, word apparently spreading through the base that something unusual was happening in Courtroom 3. Lieutenant Commander Vega had moved to a seat with a better sight line, her notepad ready. And in the VIP section, Admiral Clayton Reeves had set aside the documents he had been reviewing and was now watching the proceedings with undivided attention. Vice Admiral Thatch remained in his seat, but his posture had changed. The easy confidence had been replaced by something more guarded, his eyes tracking Elias's every movement with the wariness of a predator who had suddenly noticed another predator in the territory. Master Chief Hollister resumed his position at the main entrance. As Elias glanced in his direction, their eyes met again, and this time there was no mistaking the recognition forming in the older man's face. His brow furrowed, lips moving silently, as if trying to place a memory that refused to surface completely. The senior judge took his seat and called the tribunal to order. Commander Crenshaw, given your late entry into these proceedings, I am prepared to grant a continuance if you require time to review the evidence. It was a trap, Elias recognized immediately. A continuance would give Thatch time to regroup, to apply pressure, to find new ways to sabotage the defense. The offer of fairness was designed to achieve the opposite. That will not be necessary, Your Honor. Elias rose to his feet, and the courtroom seemed to contract around him, every eye drawn to the unlikely figure at the defense table. I am prepared to proceed with cross-examination of the prosecution's witnesses and to present closing arguments. Whitmore stood quickly. Your Honor, the prosecution has rested. Commander Crenshaw cannot simply reopen our case. Elias turned to face him. Article 46 of the UCMJ guarantees equal opportunity to obtain witnesses and other evidence. The defense has not had equal opportunity. I am requesting recall of the prosecution's witnesses for additional cross-examination, which is permitted under Rule 611 of the Military Rules of Evidence. The judge hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the legal ground Elias was claiming. Captain Whitmore, do you have a response? Whitmore's face had reddened. This is a delay tactic. The defense had ample opportunity to cross-examine during testimony. The defense, Elias replied evenly, did not have counsel during testimony. I was not present to object to leading questions, to challenge hearsay, or to expose the inconsistencies in your witnesses' statements. Admiral Chun was denied her constitutional right to effective assistance of counsel. Unless this panel wishes to provide grounds for appeal, I suggest my request be granted. The three judges conferred in low voices. Elias waited, his posture relaxed, but his mind racing through the possibilities. If they denied the request, he would have only closing arguments to work with. If they granted it, he would have the chance to unravel the prosecution's carefully constructed lies thread by thread. The senior judge straightened. The request is granted. Commander Crenshaw, you may recall the prosecution's witnesses for additional cross-examination. We will begin with Lieutenant Commander Brennan. Elias allowed himself a single slow breath. The first battle was won. Now the real work could begin. Lieutenant Commander Brennan returned to the witness stand with considerably less confidence than he had shown during his initial testimony. His eyes darted between Whitmore and the defense table, searching for reassurance that did not come. Elias rose slowly, allowing the silence to stretch until it became uncomfortable. He had learned long ago that witnesses who had been coached to deliver specific answers often crumbled when the rhythm of questioning changed. The truth had its own cadence, and lies struggled to keep pace. Lieutenant Commander Brennan, Elias began, his voice carrying easily through the silent courtroom, you testified earlier that you served as Admiral Chen's executive assistant for 3 years. Is that correct? Yes, sir. And during those 3 years, you had daily access to her office, her communications, and her decision-making processes. Brennan nodded cautiously. That is correct. Elias picked up a document from the defense table, studying it as he spoke. You also testified that Admiral Chun authorized transfers of equipment without following proper requisition procedures. I want to focus on one specific transfer: the medical supplies sent to Tijuana in March of last year. Whitmore shifted in his seat, but did not object. The question was within the scope of previous testimony. Brennan swallowed. Yes, sir. That transfer was irregular. Irregular how? Specifically, it bypassed normal channels. Admiral Chun authorized it directly without going through the proper chain of approval. Elias nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. And do you know why Admiral Chun authorized that transfer directly? I was not privy to her reasoning, sir. Were you aware that 4 United States Marines had been critically wounded in a training accident across the border that day? Brennan's face went pale. I heard something about an incident, but I did not have details. Were you aware that those Marines could not be safely transported back across the border due to the severity of their injuries? Objection. Whitmore was on his feet. Counsel is testifying. I am establishing context that the witness claims he lacked, Elias replied calmly. The prosecution presented this transfer as evidence of misconduct. I am entitled to explore whether the witness had sufficient knowledge to characterize it as such. The judge considered for a moment. Overruled. The witness may answer. Brennan looked desperately toward Whitmore, who offered no assistance. I was not aware of those specific circumstances. No, sir. So when you characterized Admiral Chen's action as irregular, you were unaware that she was responding to a medical emergency involving wounded Marines who would have died without immediate intervention. I did not have that information at the time. Elias let the admission hang in the air before continuing. Let us move to another matter. You testified that you transferred out of Admiral Chen's command. When exactly did you submit that transfer request? Brennan hesitated. I do not recall the exact date. Elias lifted another document. According to personnel records, you submitted your transfer request on September 16th of last year. Does that sound accurate? If the records say so, then yes. And according to Admiral Chen's appointment calendar, which I have reviewed during the recess, Vice Admiral Thatch visited her office on September 14th, 2 days before your transfer request. Do you recall that visit? The color drained from Brennan's face entirely. He glanced toward the VIP section where Thatch sat rigid, his jaw clenched. I do not recall specifically, sir. You do not recall a vice admiral visiting your commanding officer's office while you served as her executive assistant. There were many visitors, sir. I cannot remember them all. Elias stepped closer to the witness stand, his voice dropping to a register that forced everyone in the courtroom to lean forward. Lieutenant Commander, I'm going to ask you a direct question, and I want you to consider your answer very carefully. Were you present when Vice Admiral Thatch made inappropriate advances toward Admiral Chen? Objection. Whitmore's voice cracked with urgency. This is beyond the scope of direct examination. It is inflammatory and irrelevant. It goes directly to the witness's credibility and potential bias, Elias countered. If this witness has knowledge of events that motivated these charges, the panel deserves to know. The senior judge's face had grown troubled. He glanced at his fellow panel members, then at Vice Admiral Thatch, whose expression had hardened into stone. I will allow the question, the judge said slowly. The witness will answer. Brennan sat frozen, trapped between competing fears. The silence stretched for 5 seconds, then 10, then 15. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I was outside the office. I heard raised voices. Admiral Chen was telling the vice admiral to leave. And what happened after that conversation? Brennan closed his eyes. 2 days later, I was told that my career prospects would improve significantly if I requested a transfer and cooperated with any future inquiries regarding Admiral Chen's conduct. Who told you that, Lieutenant Commander? The question hung in the air like a blade. Brennan's hands gripped the arms of the witness chair until his knuckles went white. I received a call, he whispered, from Vice Admiral Thatch's office. The courtroom erupted. Officers in the gallery exchanged shocked glances. Lieutenant Commander Vega wrote furiously. Admiral Reeves leaned forward, his face a mask of controlled fury. And Vice Admiral Thatch, for the first time since the tribunal began, looked afraid. Elias turned to face the panel, his voice cutting through the chaos. Your Honors, I move to have Admiral Chen's harassment complaint entered into evidence. It is now directly relevant to the credibility of every witness the prosecution has presented. The senior judge struck his gavel 3 times before order was restored. He looked at Whitmore, who sat slumped at the prosecution table with his head in his hands. Captain Whitmore, do you wish to respond? Whitmore said nothing. The motion is granted, the judge said quietly. The complaint will be admitted. The harassment complaint was passed among the panel members in silence. each judge reading Admiral Chen's detailed account of Vice Admiral Thatch's conduct. The document described a pattern of unwanted advances spanning 8 months, culminating in a confrontation in her office where Thatch had made clear that her career would suffer if she continued to refuse him. As the judges read, Elias recalled Commander Salinas to the stand. The logistics officer approached the witness chair with none of his earlier polish, his confidence shattered by what Brennan's testimony had revealed. Commander Salinas, Elias began, you testified earlier that Admiral Chen ordered you to falsify inventory reports. I want to revisit that claim. Salinas gripped the arms of the chair. My testimony stands. Does it? Elias lifted a folder from the defense table. I have here the original inventory reports from February of last year. The ones you claim Admiral Chen ordered you to falsify. He paused, flipping through pages. These reports show a vendor error that was corrected within 48 hours, exactly as Admiral Chen stated in her response. There is no falsification. There is no cover-up. There is only a routine supply chain issue that was resolved through proper channels. Salinas said nothing. Commander, did Admiral Chen ever directly order you to falsify any document? The silence stretched. Salinas's eyes moved to Vice Admiral Thatch, who sat motionless in the VIP section, his face carved from granite. Commander, Elias repeated, his voice hardening. You're under oath. Did Admiral Chen ever directly order you to falsify any document? Salinas's shoulders collapsed. No, sir, he whispered. She did not. Then why did you testify that she did? The answer came in fragments, pulled from a man who had gambled his integrity and lost. I was approached. After my transfer, I was told that if I cooperated with the investigation, I would receive a favorable assignment. If I refused, my career would stagnate. Who approached you, Commander? Salinas closed his eyes. Captain Whitmore, acting on instructions from Vice Admiral Thatch's office. The gallery erupted again, louder this time. Admiral Reeves rose from his seat, his command presence silencing the chaos without a word spoken. He moved to the aisle, his eyes fixed on Vice Admiral Thatch with an expression that promised consequences. Master Chief Hollister had not moved from his position by the door, but his entire bearing had changed. He stood at rigid attention, his eyes locked on Elias with an intensity that bordered on reverence. His lips moved again, silently forming syllables that refused to coalesce into recognition. Your Honors, Elias said, turning to face the panel, the defense moves for immediate dismissal of all charges. The prosecution's case has been built entirely on coerced testimony and manufactured evidence, orchestrated by Vice Admiral Thatch as retaliation against Admiral Chen for reporting his harassment. The senior judge looked overwhelmed, caught between procedure and the devastation unfolding before him. Captain Whitmore, do you have any response? Whitmore remained seated, his face buried in his hands. When he finally looked up, his expression held the hollow resignation of a man watching his career disintegrate. I have no response, Your Honor. Vice Admiral Thatch rose abruptly from his seat. This is absurd, he declared, his voice booming across the courtroom. I will not sit here and allow my reputation to be destroyed by the ravings of a homeless vagrant playing at lawyer. Every head turned toward him. Admiral Reeves stepped into the aisle, blocking Thatch's path to the exit. Gordon, Reeves said quietly, the use of the first name carrying more weight than any rank. I suggest you remain until this tribunal has concluded. You have no authority here, Clayton. This is a JAG matter, not a fleet command issue. Elias spoke without turning around. Actually, Vice Admiral, as Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Reeves has oversight authority over any proceeding that involves potential misconduct by a flag officer. His voice carried the precise cadence of someone citing regulations from memory. Under Navy Regulations Article 0818, he may assume direct control of any investigation or tribunal where command integrity is in question. Thatch's face contorted with fury. He turned his glare on Elias, truly seeing him for the first time. And who exactly are you to lecture me on regulations? Master Chief Hollister's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Sentinel. The word hung in the air. Thatch froze. Admiral Reeves's head snapped toward Hollister, then toward Elias. Hollister stepped forward, his voice trembling with emotion. I know who you are. I was there. Nazariah, 2003. You held that building for 19 hours while calling in legal arguments on a satellite phone. You saved 11 men with your rifle and 3 more with your briefs. He swallowed hard. We thought you were dead, sir. We all thought you were dead. The courtroom had gone absolutely silent. Not the silence of shock, but the silence of revelation, of pieces falling into place, of understanding dawning across dozens of faces simultaneously. Admiral Reeves moved slowly toward the defense table, his eyes never leaving Elias. Commander Crenshaw, he said softly. Sentinel, my God, we searched for you for years. Elias met his gaze without flinching. I was not ready to be found, Admiral. And now, Elias looked at Admiral Chun, who stood beside him with tears streaming down her face. Now, I remembered why I used to believe in the law. Behind them, Vice Admiral Thatch had gone pale, the full weight of his situation finally crashing down upon him. He had tried to destroy a decorated admiral, and in doing so, he had awakened a legend. The name Sentinel moved through the gallery like wind through dry grass. Officers leaned toward one another, whispering fragments of a legend they had heard in wardrooms and training facilities across the fleet. The lawyer who became a SEAL. The operator who argued cases from foxholes. The man who had vanished 6 years ago and been mourned as another casualty of a war that never stopped claiming its veterans. Admiral Reeves stood before the defense table, his bearing that of a man confronting a ghost he had never expected to see in the flesh. I was a lieutenant commander when your operation became required reading at the War College, he said quietly. 19 hours. 11 men extracted. 3 Marines exonerated. And you did it all simultaneously. Elias said nothing. His sleeve had ridden up during the intensity of his cross-examination, exposing the faded tattoo on his forearm. The trident and the scales of justice, intertwined in ink that had blurred with time but remained unmistakable in its meaning. Lieutenant Commander Vega had risen from her seat in the press section, her notepad forgotten. She approached the defense table with the hesitant steps of someone who had been waiting for this moment without knowing it. Commander Crenshaw, she said, I have been documenting irregularities in Vice Admiral Thatch's conduct for 18 months. Harassment complaints buried. Investigations derailed. Careers destroyed. She held out a folder thick with papers. I never had the standing to bring it forward. But you do. Elias took the folder without breaking eye contact. How many, he asked. 7 women. All flag officers or senior commanders. All reported harassment. All faced retaliation. She paused, her voice catching. Admiral Chun is not the first. She's just the first who refused to disappear quietly. The senior judge had watched the proceedings spiral beyond his control, his face ashen with the realization of what his tribunal had nearly accomplished. He struck his gavel once, more from habit than authority. Commander Crenshaw, he said, his voice unsteady. In light of these revelations, the panel is prepared to hear your motion for dismissal. Elias turned to face the bench, but before he could speak, Vice Admiral Thatch made his move. He strode toward the main exit, shouldering past a junior officer who stumbled into the gallery seats. Master Chief Hollister stepped into his path. Sir, he said, his voice carrying the steel of 3 decades of service, I cannot allow you to leave. Stand aside, Chief. That is an order. Hollister did not move. With respect, Admiral, I do not take orders from officers who betray their own. Thatch's hand came up, whether to push past Hollister or strike him, but Admiral Reeves's voice froze him in place. Gordon. The single word carried the weight of command that had guided carrier battle groups through combat. You will remain in this courtroom until these proceedings are concluded. You will then accompany shore patrol to my office, where you will be formally relieved of duty pending investigation. He paused, letting each word land like a hammer blow. Any attempt to leave will be treated as consciousness of guilt and will be noted in the official record. Thatch turned slowly, his face a mask of barely controlled rage. You are destroying 40 years of service over the accusations of a homeless derelict and a woman who could not handle a compliment. The courtroom went cold. Admiral Chun stepped forward, her voice steady for the first time since the tribunal began. A compliment, she repeated. You cornered me in my office. You put your hands on me. You told me that my career depended on being more accommodating. When I reported you through proper channels, you manufactured charges to destroy everything I had built in 32 years of service. She stood directly before him now, her eyes holding his without flinching. That is not a compliment, Admiral. That is assault. That is abuse of power. That is the betrayal of every oath you ever swore. Thatch opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. For the first time, facing not a tribunal he had rigged, but a woman he had tried to break, he had nothing to say. Elias addressed the panel, his voice carrying the precise authority that had once commanded courtrooms across the fleet. Your Honors, the defense renews its motion for immediate dismissal of all charges against Rear Admiral Margaret Chin. The prosecution's case was built on coerced testimony, manufactured evidence, and systematic abuse of the military justice system. Every witness has recanted under cross-examination. The motive for these charges has been established as personal retaliation by Vice Admiral Thatch. He paused, looking at each judge in turn. But dismissal is not enough. This panel has the authority to recommend investigation into prosecutorial misconduct by Captain Whitmore and obstruction of justice by Vice Admiral Thatch. I urge you to exercise that authority, not for Admiral Chin's sake alone, but for the 7 other women whose complaints were buried. For every service member who has ever been sacrificed to protect a predator in uniform. The senior judge conferred briefly with his fellow panel members. When he turned back to face the courtroom, his expression had hardened with resolve. All charges against Rear Admiral Margaret Chun are dismissed with prejudice, he announced. This panel further recommends immediate investigation into Vice Admiral Thatch and Captain Whitmore for conspiracy, witness tampering, and obstruction of military justice. He struck his gavel with finality. This tribunal is adjourned. Admiral Chun reached for Elias's hand, gripping it as if it were the only solid thing in a world that had just shifted beneath her feet. Her voice was barely a whisper. Thank you. Thank you for standing when no one else would. Elias looked down at their joined hands, feeling human contact he had not allowed himself in 6 years. You reminded me, he said quietly, that some battles are still worth fighting. The shore patrol arrived within minutes. 2 young petty officers who clearly had not expected their duty day to include escorting a vice admiral from a courtroom in disgrace. Thatch walked between them with his chin raised, clinging to the last shreds of dignity even as whispers followed him through the door. Captain Whitmore was escorted separately, his face blank with the 1,000-yard stare of a man whose future had collapsed in the span of an hour. The gallery did not disperse. Officers who had come expecting to witness the end of Admiral Chin's career remained in their seats, processing what they had seen instead. Some spoke in low voices, comparing fragments of the Sentinel legend they had heard over the years. Others simply watched Elias, studying the man who had emerged from obscurity to dismantle a conspiracy in a single afternoon. Master Chief Hollister approached the defense table with the measured steps of a man carrying something precious and fragile. He stopped at attention, his hand rising to a salute that trembled with emotion. Commander Crenshaw, he said, his voice thick. I was a petty officer second class in 2003. My brother was one of the 11, David Hollister. You carried him 400 meters through hostile fire after he took shrapnel to his leg. He told me about it before he passed, 6 years later from complications. He swallowed hard. He said you never left anyone behind. Not in combat. Not in the courtroom. Elias returned the salute slowly, his own eyes glistening. I remember David, he said quietly. He kept making jokes about how his wife was going to kill him for ruining his dress whites. Even with his leg torn up, he would not stop laughing. Hollister's composure broke. A single sob escaped before he regained control, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. We thought we lost you, sir. When you disappeared, the teams put out word through every channel we had. Nobody knew what happened. I lost myself for a while, Chief. Elias glanced at Admiral Chun, who stood nearby with Lieutenant Commander Vega. Sometimes it takes seeing someone else abandoned to remember that you still know how to stand. Admiral Reeves had been conferring with his aide near the judge's bench, but now he approached the defense table with purpose. The gallery fell silent as the Chief of Naval Operations stopped before the man in donated clothes who had just dismantled a flag officer's conspiracy. Commander Crenshaw, Reeves said formally, on behalf of the United States Navy, I want to express my personal gratitude for what you did here today. Not just for Admiral Chun, but for the integrity of the institution we serve. He paused, his expression softening. I also want to apologize. We should have found you. We should have done more to bring you home. Elias shook his head slowly. I was not lost because no one was looking, Admiral. I was lost because I did not want to be found. He touched his chest, where Elena's nursing pin pressed against his skin beneath the worn fabric. Someone I loved was taken from me. The law I had devoted my life to failed to protect her. I could not reconcile what I believed with what I had experienced. Reeves nodded, understanding passing between two men who had both seen the gap between ideals and reality. And now he asked, now I remember that the law does not fail. People fail the law. Elias looked around the courtroom, at the officers still watching, at the shore patrol securing evidence, at the panel judges who were already drafting their recommendations. When we stop fighting for it, when we walk away because the fight seems hopeless, that is when injustice wins. Admiral Chen stepped forward, her composure restored but her eyes still bright with unshed tears. Commander, you appeared in this courtroom with nothing but a faded ID card and a worn jacket. You had no resources, no support, no preparation time. How did you know you could win? I did not know, Elias admitted, but I knew I could not watch you be destroyed without trying. He paused, something shifting in his expression. 6 years ago, I wrote a note that said I could no longer serve what I could not believe in. He looked at her directly. Today, you reminded me that belief is not a passive state. It requires action. It requires standing up even when standing seems impossible. Lieutenant Commander Vega approached with her folder of documentation, her expression caught between professional composure and personal emotion. Commander Crenshaw, my investigation into Vice Admiral Thatch is going to require testimony from everyone involved. I would like to request your assistance in building the case. Elias looked at the folder, thick with evidence of years of abuse and corruption. 7 women, he said quietly. 7 careers threatened or destroyed. 8, if we had not stopped it today. Vega glanced at Admiral Chun. Probably more we do not know about yet. The weight of what remained to be done settled over Elias like a familiar burden. For 6 years, he had carried only guilt and grief. Now he felt something else taking shape, something that had driven him through law school and BUD/S in 19 hours in a shattered building in Nazariah. Purpose. Admiral Chun touched his arm gently. Commander, where have you been living? The question was simple, but it carried the weight of everything that would come next. Elias hesitated, old instincts urging him toward deflection, toward the comfortable anonymity of the streets. Under the Harbor Street overpass, he said finally, for the past 4 years. The silence that followed was not pity. It was something closer to resolve. Not anymore, Admiral Chin said firmly. Not one more night. She looked at Admiral Reeves, who nodded once. We take care of our own, Commander. It is past time we started taking care of you. 3 months had passed since the tribunal that changed everything. The morning sun filtered through the window of a modest apartment in San Diego, casting long shadows across a room that held few possessions but carried immense meaning. Elias stood before the mirror, adjusting the collar of a shirt that actually fit, studying a face that had begun to lose the gaunt hollows of years spent surviving rather than living. On the nightstand beside his bed, Elena's nursing pin rested next to her photograph. He had spoken to her that morning, as he did every morning now, but the words had changed. I argued again yesterday, he had told her image. A young corpsman facing discharge over a paperwork error his command should have caught. We won. He would have smiled at the simplicity of that statement. He could almost hear her response, the gentle teasing about how he always made things sound smaller than they were. The apartment had been arranged by Admiral Chun, who had refused to let him decline. "It is not charity," she had said firmly. "It is back pay for services rendered to the United States Navy. Consider it the retainer I should have offered before you saved my career." He had accepted, not because he believed he deserved it, but because he had finally understood that accepting help was not weakness. It was trust. It was allowing others to stand for him the way he had stood for them. The folder on his desk contained 17 active cases. Veterans facing wrongful discharge. Service members caught in bureaucratic nightmares that threatened to erase years of honorable service. Men and women who had been abandoned by a system that should have protected them. Dr. Marion Foster had made good on her years of quiet offers, clearing a desk by the window of her legal aid office and filling it with files before he could change his mind. "When you are ready," she had said, "and if you are never ready, the desk will still be here." He had been ready. Not healed, not whole, but ready. There was a difference, he had learned, between being broken and being unable to function. The cracks remained. They would always remain. But cracks could let light through as easily as darkness. His phone buzzed with a message from Master Chief Hollister. Coffee at 11. The usual place. It had become a ritual. These monthly meetings where two men who had been connected by a single night in Nazariah sat across from each other and talked about everything except the weight they both carried. Sometimes they discussed David, the brother Hollister had lost, the man Elias had carried through fire. Sometimes they simply sat in comfortable silence, two veterans who understood that presence mattered more than words. The drive to the veterans' cemetery took 20 minutes. Elias made it every Sunday now, parking in the same spot, walking the same path through rows of white headstones until he reached the marker he had been unable to visit for 6 years. Eleni Kronschau, beloved wife, healer of wounds seen and unseen. He knelt before the stone, placing a single white rose against the marble. The morning dew was cold on his knees, but he did not move. "I cannot save you," he said quietly. "The law I believed in failed to protect you. And for 6 years, I punished myself by refusing to believe in anything." He paused, tracing the letters of her name with his fingertip. "But I remember now what you always told me, that the broken can still serve. That scars are proof of survival, not marks of shame. That standing up for others is how we honor those we could not save." The wind stirred the grass around him, carrying the distant sound of taps from another burial somewhere in the vast cemetery. "I am defending them again, Elena. All of them. The ones the system forgets. The ones who have no voice." He smiled, a fragile expression that held more grief than joy but was genuine nonetheless. "And sometimes when I am arguing a motion or cross-examining a witness, I can feel you beside me, still believing in me, still telling me to fight." He rose slowly, his knees protesting the cold ground, and stood at attention before her grave. "I love you," he whispered. "I will always love you, and I will keep fighting until I see you again." The drive back to the city took him past the Harbor Street overpass. He slowed as he approached, looking at the concrete pillars where he had spent 4 years hiding from a world that had hurt him too deeply to face. A figure sat huddled against the far pillar, wrapped in a blanket that had seen better days. Elias pulled over. The young man who looked up at his approach had the eyes of someone who had seen combat, the 1,000-yard stare that marked those who had returned from war but had not yet found their way home. "You serve," Elias said. It was not a question. The young man nodded slowly. "2 tours. Kandahar." He looked away. "But I guess that does not matter much now." Elias lowered himself to sit on the cold concrete, ignoring the protest of joints that had grown accustomed to softer surfaces. "It matters," he said. "It will always matter." He reached into his jacket and produced a card. "My name is Elias. I am an attorney. I work with veterans who need help navigating the system." The young man took the card, studied it with suspicion born of too many broken promises. "Why do you care?" Elias looked at the overpass, at the shadows where he had once hidden from his own pain. "Because someone stood for me when I had forgotten how to stand for myself." He met the young man's eyes. And now it is my turn to stand for others. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that second chances are possible and that heroes can be found in the most unexpected places, please subscribe to our channel. And right now on your screen, you will see another incredible story waiting for you. Click it, watch it, and remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Some of them might just be legendary. The broken can still serve. The fallen can still rise. And sometimes the greatest act of courage is not charging into enemy fire. It is accepting help and then offering that same help to others. The young veteran looked at the card for a long moment. Then slowly he nodded. Elias Crenshaw, once called Sentinel, smiled. It was not much, but it was a start.